This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, we'll introduce the main characters. Will Hunting. Will is a 20-year-old orphan. He's poor, a blue-collar worker with blue-collar friends living in a rough neighborhood. He works as a janitor at MIT and secretly solves math equations on the blackboards of classrooms, and he does so effortlessly. We also learn that he was physically abused as a child and has trust issues due to abandonment. We'll be exploring the following three principal relationships in the movie. Professor. He's an MIT professor and won the Fields Medal, which is a very prestigious award in mathematics. The first time the professor meets Will, he thinks Will is vandalizing the math equation on the blackboard and tells him off, but discovers that Will is actually a genius. The professor is amazed. The professor finds out Will is in trouble with the law and comes to an agreement with the judge that Will can avoid jail time on condition that Will, 1, does math with the professor, and 2, sees a therapist. Professor wants to help Will actualize his potential, and is harder on Will, but still seems to care about him, and there's even a scene of them working together to solve a math problem. Professor uses his connections to set Will up for some prestigious and high-order job interviews, even though Will sometimes embarrasses the professor with his attitude and disparages the interviewers. Admittedly, the professor is less interested in focusing on Will's emotional well-being and does not like making excuses for Will, even though Will had a rough childhood. Then there's the therapist, played by Robin Williams. The therapist is very bright, but not very accomplished. He has no awards, he has no medals, unlike the professor, his former college roommate. Therapist is a Vietnam War veteran, a widower for the love of his life, and he is currently a professor at a community college and a therapist. Robin Williams enters the picture because Will mocks all the therapists the professor sets Will up with, so the professor finally brings in Robin Williams. Therapist, I'll be referring to Robin Williams as therapist, it'll just be interchangeable. Therapist is able to get through to Will, very slowly and with challenges. Therapist can also relate to Will because therapist has a similar background in that he grew up in difficult economic conditions and was abused as a kid by an alcoholic father. Therapist wants Will to follow his heart, to play his hand, and is softer on Will, but still challenges him. Therapist's softer approach is a source of frustration to the professor, who thinks Robin Williams is trying to make Will comfortable with the idea of failure, because professor sees therapist as a failure, an underachiever, and a quitter. Therapist rejects this and asserts his life choices were exactly that, conscious choices. He insists he's trying to help Will. In a later therapy session, Robin Williams asks Will, "What do you want to do?" Will says he'd be cool laying brick or fixing cars. That's important work. Therapist agrees, but says, "Then why do you solve those equations secretly? Why are you hiding? It's a cop-out to say I didn't ask for this. You got your genius as a gift. So, what do you want to do?" Will does not have an answer. Then lastly, there's Chucky. That's Will's best friend, and he's played by Ben Affleck. Will trusts him absolutely, and Chucky is super loyal to Will. They're like family. Towards the end of the movie, Will and Chucky are working a construction job, and Will tells Chucky he's excited to eventually get married to a nice girl, and he and Chucky can raise their families together. Chucky tells Will that if Will is still here, doing this low-grade construction job in 20 years, Chucky will kill him. Chucky says, "You don't owe it to yourself. You owe it to me, and our friends." Chucky effectively tells Will to cash his golden ticket and get out of here and go make a better life for yourself. This is a major impetus for Will to make a real move. This leads us into the following questions, namely, does Will have an obligation, seemingly a moral obligation, to actualize himself? If he does, is it because he owes it to himself, or is it because he owes it to others? 2. How do we resolve 1. Being true to what one wants versus 2. Actualizing one's own potential and even being an asset to other people? The professor, and Robin Williams, and Chucky all appear to agree that Will would be copping out by not using his talents. Is that true? Taking this from a different angle, does Will owe it to others, for example, to science, for the benefit of society, or to his socioeconomic peers, to manifest his potential? If so, in what way? 3. As an educator, a mentor, a friend, to what degree do you push a person, and to what degree do you let go and let the person figure out what he wants to do? 4. With respect to pushing Will, Is the professor manipulating Will, as Robin Williams claims? When does pushing become manipulation? Sometimes education has to be subtle. Subtlety doesn't automatically mean manipulation. When do you cross the line? 5. It's true that the professor can be dismissive of Will's emotional problems. How do we balance that? Will's not 13, but he's also not 35. He's 20. He's not a kid. He's a young man. How long do we have to wait for people to get over their issues and start taking responsibility and making decisions? It's especially poignant when Professor says sometimes he wishes he had never met Will to see Will throw it all away. We can imagine meeting someone with tremendous talent who simply refused to use it. It can be maddening. Let's see how the Torah approaches these dilemmas. I'm excited to welcome Rabbi Jack Cohen to this episode to answer our questions. Rabbi Cohen serves as the Director of Jewish Education and Community Engagement for Hebrew Academy High School of Miami, where he strives to teach Jewish philosophy and character development in a way that is relevant and resonant to 21st century teenagers. He also coaches and supports teachers in the school and works to be an educational bridge to parents and the broader community. Rabbi Cohen has been teaching and mentoring young people for over 15 years with a focus on building educational ecosystems of growth opportunities that allow participants to choose their own adventure. Prior to his current role, Rabbi Cohen served as Director of Education for Olami North America, and prior to that, as Director of Education for Olami Manhattan. He maintains a close connection with his own mentors, Rav Beryl Gershenfeld, Rosh Yeshiva of Machon Shlomo and Machon Yaakov, and founder of Maor, and Rav Emanuel Bernstein, renowned author and lecturer. Rabbi Cohen learned in the Mir Yeshiva and Yad Saadia Kollel in Jerusalem. He holds a bachelor's degree in physics and philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's degree in education from Harvard. He publishes articles about life wisdom from Judaism regularly on his website, theexpressionoflife.com. He also has a podcast called Breakthrough, available on Spotify, which is recorded every week in Aventura, Florida, in an interactive Ask What's on Your Mind format. I will post the links to all below. So, just looking at this movie, I guess the main question we have is, does Will have an obligation, seemingly a moral obligation, to kind of use his genius, to actualize his potential? And that's kind of stated generally. Perhaps more specifically, is it that, does Will owe it to himself to do so? Does he owe it to others to manifest his potential? That's our question. Does Will have a moral obligation to use his genius? And if he does, is it more about like doing it for himself, or is it for others? And just to kind of like, why is this even a dilemma? It sounds obvious, but the dilemma is, what if Will doesn't want to do that, right? Will explicitly says like, hey, look, I want to hang out in the area I grew up in, hanging out with my friends, raising our families together. That seems pretty normal perspective. A person wants to kind of live their own life. Why would they owe anything to anybody else? That's the question.
All right. So I think this question is among the most profound questions of the human condition. So we're going to go deep, real fast. The question really is, does your life belong to you, right? Is your life an asset that you own? Intuitively, it is. I mean, there's nothing that's more yours than your life. But no one deserves to be born, by definition. There's nothing you could have done to deserve to be born. So,
sorry, what do you mean by like deserves? You mean if you deserve to be born, then you have a right to your life? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, if I work, I deserve my salary, right? If I don't get paid, I can demand it and I can sue for it, right? If I don't get paid. Right. So it's mine because I earned it, right? But your life, by definition, we just showed up. We just showed up. Our life is a gift. In Hebrew, the way you say birthday is actually birthday, birthed, Yom Huledet, right? It's not Yom Holadah, it's Yom Huledet, the day that you were birthed, because really that's actually more precise. We give, people gifts on their birthdays as if they did something, but actually there's actually no day that you did less than the day you were born.
And that's a funny way of looking at it, but I hear the point.
It should really be a day you should call up your mom and thank her for bringing you into the world and thank Hashem. And that's really
Mother's Day.
It should be Mother's Day. Every birthday should be your Mother's Day, your mother's personal Mother's Day. Now, the thing is like this. This puts a person in a very delicate psychological situation. A person, because your life and everything about it was gifted to you, so that leads to human angst. Human angst. There's a sense that my life is a gift. What am I doing? What am I doing with it? Am I making good on this gift? Maybe looking at it slightly different than a gift. Think about it as an investment, right? If you're a venture investment, right? It's kind of like a gift. It's kind of like your big break, right? When a startup gets their first big investment, it's like they have their big break. And so it's very, very nerve wracking in the beginning stages of a company. It's very, very nerve wracking because some angel investor, some venture capitalist gave them an enormous amount of money that is, by definition, it's more than what the company is worth right now. That's the whole point. It's based on what they're going to do with it. So it creates a lot of angst. And I think people all have that kind of angst. Rabbi Dr. Avram Twersky, a really special person. I had a chance to speak to him a couple times. He writes in a lot of his books about this phenomenon, the phenomenon of self-esteem. And he writes that self-esteem, interestingly, is more of a problem for people with more potential, more gifted. The more gifted you are, the more you suffer from self-esteem issues. Because if you're kind of like a schlubby guy and you're not very gifted objectively, let's just say for the sake of argument, right? So you're not up late at night wondering what you're going to do with your life. You're doing whatever you're doing and no one's really bothering you about it. No one's expecting you to do more with your life. Okay, it's a caricature, but let's just say. But someone who's really bright, who's really good with people, who's charismatic, who's handsome, who's this, that, and the other thing, their entire lives, people are like, you're so gifted, you're so special, you have so much potential. I wonder what you're going to do with your life, right? And that can drive a person mad because that person, no matter what they do, they feel like they're not doing enough. Okay, and that's the problem of self-esteem in kind of Jewish Torah language. So it's called the problem of the bread of shame. Okay, and the bread of shame is a kind of a Kabbalistic idiom for when a poor person receives bread for free, it shames them, which is why if a person has any kind of human dignity, it's very hard for them to look in the eye the one who's being charitable to them because they feel embarrassed that they're getting something for free. It like really kind of like touches on their human dignity. Human dignity is to earn your keep, to work for a living and to feel proud. Not bad pride, good pride. Proud in the sense of like, I'm a mensch. I took care of myself, right? When it receives a gift, the natural healthy reaction is to be ashamed. Okay, the healthy reaction in that case is to be ashamed. If a person is not ashamed to get a handout, there's something unhealthy about that because they lost their sense of human dignity. So that's called the bread of shame. So basically, this is God's dilemma. God's dilemma is that God wants to give us a good life. He wants to give us God has nothing. From this perspective, God is love, is all love. God has nothing to gain from us. He doesn't need anything from us. Why is he doing anything for us? It must be not for his own benefit because that's kind of nonsense to benefit God. It must be for our benefit. The problem is God can't just give us a good life because if he gave us a good life, we're not going to feel like it's our lives. And so we have to earn our keep. So the dynamic is God brings us into the world. Everyone's born into the world with some set of assets, physical, genetic, familial, socioeconomic, circumstantial, all the assets, all the blessings of our lives. At some point, a person feels like, what am I doing with myself? So this, I think, is the setup for talking about our subject, which is education, chinuch. Okay, the Hebrew word for it is chinuch. Because education has to balance these two. Education has to love and care for and nurture and share resources and all these things. What we kind of traditionally think about like a loving parent or whatever, loving teacher, but that can't be the sum total of education. Education must help the person fend for themselves. You can't just feed a man a fish their whole life. That's doing a disservice. You have to teach him or her how to fish, right? And that's the push and pull of education. So, okay, let's just go back to, this is all kind of prelude to your question. Who do you owe your own actualization of your potential to? We're supposed to make the most of our lives. Is it for our own personal benefit? Is it we're supposed to make the most of our lives so that others can benefit? This is, I think, the question that we're trying to get to, that the movie's revolving around. So you could say you owe God because God gave you your life. So you could say kind of you owe it to him. Of course, that's hard to conceptualize because what's God going to do with my life? I mean, what does he need? What does he need my life for? So it's a little bit hard to conceptualize and hard to be motivated by that, let's say. Okay, but we can come back to that. Right. You could say you owe it to yourself, which was the Robin Williams approach to will. Because, listen, God gave you an opportunity. God wants to give you a good life. But he knows that it's only going to be a really good life. And you're only going to realize as you enter into adulthood if you earn it yourself. It's not a good life just because you were born gifted, whether it's materially or intellectually or whatever. It's a good life because you earned it, but you owe it to yourself to work hard. If you have potential, you owe it to yourself. You're going to be ashamed of yourself. You're going to remain ashamed of yourself into adulthood. Aside from that, there's the whole psychological inner dimension of that, which is, how do I motivate myself? For some people, they can motivate themselves more in terms of thinking about what they can do for others with their lives. That's like sometimes it's for some people, it's actually easier to think about the value they can add to others' lives, or what will happen to the world, or what will happen to my community, or what will happen to my kids if I don't do X, Y, or Z. For some people, it's kind of they can motivate themselves for themselves. How can I live with myself if I don't actualize my own potential? I'm going to feel so guilty. Or I want to feel the nachas, the fulfillment of overcoming a challenge, of accomplishing something, right? So there's a whole psychological dimension. From an educational point of view, we have to look at these two motivators and the person in front of us and saying, what can we do by hook or by crook to get this person to make the most of themselves? The basic rule of education is you do what works. You do what works. So when kids are kids, so you can motivate them with candy, you can motivate them with threats, but obviously that's not the end goal, because if the person does not learn to motivate themselves, it's going to be short-lived. We'll get into this more. Let me just focus back on your specific question. Which motivation are you going to choose to kind of focus on as an educator for a particular kid or student or whatever? Do you get them to say, hey, you're going to be so ashamed of yourself if you don't get your act together? Or do you say, you're going to be so proud of yourself if you get your act together? Or do you say, the world needs you? You know, I actually remember when I was in college, my rabbi in college, now my dear friend and brother, Rabbi Shmuel Lin, I remember very clearly when he called me and he gave me the Jewish people need you shmooze, you know? And I like, need me? Like, who am I? Like, I'm a schlub, you know, I'm a college kid, you know?
Well, if you don't mind, what does a schlub mean? You use that word twice.
Did I use the word schlub twice? I must be
you call them like schlubby. Like, I'm
not really a fluent Yiddish speaker, but I think schlub means like a nobody, you know, like a whatever.
Okay.
Yiddish words are like onomatopoeias. Think about what it sounds like. You're like, oh yeah, that's a schlub.
That makes sense.
But anyway, he said to me like the Jewish world needs you, which is a funny thing because I'm just like a college kid. Like, what do you mean the Jewish world needs me? But it did speak to me in a very deep way. Now, if he would have said to me, you owe it to yourself it's kind of like more amorphous. I think for me in that moment in my life, that would have been a bit more amorphous. Like, you owe it to yourself to make something of yourself. But I could understand that there's this thing called the Jewish people. And that in theory that if I use my talents properly, that I could be a purveyor of some benefit to the Jewish people. I think that spoke to me more. For me personally, is that what's going to speak to all people? I don't think so. But anyways, that's, I think, the answer to your question. But I think it does segue, I think, to another important theme, which is the tension between kind of manipulating and allowing the person to choose and grow on their own, you know, through intrinsic motivation. Manipulating could be, you know, the hook or crook could be a carrot or a stick. You know, if you do this, you'll get this benefit to you, the proverbial candy that we offer the kid if they do what we want. And the stick can be the threat. If you don't do it, then, you know, you'll be grounded. If you don't do it, you'll lose your allowance, kind of thing. That's all in the category of control. And the other category is called real education. It's called chinuch. This is a paradigm that I got from Rabbi Jack Cohen, who wrote an excellent book in Hebrew, and it was translated to English called Spare the Child. It's really excellent. I can't recommend it enough. And the question is, when do you use which? But all of that is to serve actually getting the person to make a choice, the light bulb going off, and they choose on their own volition. That's really where the magic is happening.
Yeah, so just about control and chinuch, that is definitely a point I want to touch back on, because I think that relates a lot to the different approaches between like Robin Williams' character and the therapist and the professor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll touch back on that in just a moment. But just again, going back to the original question in terms of a lot of what you said in terms of the background, that like, does Will have a moral obligation to actualize himself and to use his genius? So there's a lot of discussion about how he was effectively given that as a gift. Now, you could say that about anybody. The person who's born into a billionaire family, so he has a responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? Well, let's just say Will said, you know what? And he ignores Chucky and he says, you know, Chucky, I don't care what you think. I don't care about doing this for you. I want to do this for me. To quote Will, he said, you know, I'm going to live here the rest of my life. We'll be neighbors, have little kids, take them to Little League up at Foley Field. So let's say, and no, Chucky gets upset and says, no, you don't owe it to yourself. You owe it to me. Let's say Will says, you know, forget you. This is what I want to do. I want to come over, watch the Patriots games and raise our kids together, and tough luck. Is that a problem? And if that is a problem, then why is it a problem? Why can't he just choose to do what he wants with his life? Let's just say we were to take a guy who could become like a super top-notch investment banker. He could become CEO, make millions of dollars with a super prestigious position, but he's like 5 years in, and he says, you know, I just don't think this is the life for me. I know I can make it to the top. I know I can, but I value hanging with my family. And so he goes in and he takes a much simpler track. And you can say the same thing, even if it's not a money thing. Let's say it's more of an intrinsic talent, right? Kind of like that's what Will has. He has a genius. What if you take like a classical pianist, right? Or a super athletic person, and they just don't want the lifestyle. They don't want to be involved in that kind of, they don't want to be involved with football, basketball, whatever it is. Or if you take the pianist, like just, you know, this is a Jewish podcast, so the guy has to keep Shabbat, and chances are most of the concerts will be on a Friday night or a Saturday night. I can't imagine our response would be, he's not living up to his potential because he's not playing as a concert pianist. That seems to me like that's wrong. So what's wrong about Will's decision to say, hey, like I value raising my children in Foley's Field and working in construction, and the fact that I'm a genius, well, that's my decision. I don't feel like it. Or to use his words, I don't want to be a lab rat. So I think that we'll get to the chinuch in just a moment, but what does Judaism have to say about that? Is that wrong? That seems to me like it's a noble decision to not go and be at the top of the food chain at an investment bank and instead focus on your family.
Mm-hmm. So let me take a step back, because I think you're asking good questions, but I think you're going into different kind of branches of the decision tree. Let's just go back to, I think, the most fundamental piece, okay? That I think we started with. The thing we're talking about here, in the language of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, known as the Ramchal, he lived in the 1700s in Italy and then later Amsterdam, one of the great Kabbalists, mystics, and really his focus was really people actualizing their potential. That was really his focus. And he, in the opening of his book, he says that what he's coming to help a person grapple with is something that he or she knows very well, but he hides from it, which is what he calls chovato be'olamo. Every person has a chova, an obligation, be'olamo, in his world. Every person lives in some corner of the world, right? No two people's corner of the world is exactly the same, because you're born into a certain part of your society, right? That's where you live. And every person has his or her obligation. But the word chova is more than obligation. Obligation is a debt. Every person has a debt that they have to repay, which we mentioned before. Meaning every person has a set of assets. Those assets don't come for free. I mean, they were given for free, but they come with expectations. The expectation is that you use them. And the nature of a person is to hide from that debt entirely. Whether it comes from laziness in some low-level way, right? There's a thing called laziness. I don't want to accept that I'm gifted, because accepting that I'm gifted, I know intrinsically, forget theologically, psychologically, existentially comes with a sense of, I have to use my gifts, and I don't want to. I don't want the guilt associated with it. So so again, why don't I want to? Because why do I think I'm going to fail and therefore feel guilty? Because I'm kind of lazy. Everyone's a little lazy. Everyone's kind of inertial. I'm mentally lazy. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to go think about the details of how I'm actually going to do it. I'm physically lazy. I'd rather just do nothing and chill.
That definitely sounds like.
But it's both. It's a combination. I think everyone has some level of physical laziness. Even beyond it, there's mental laziness of like, I remember at some point I decided I wanted to go to graduate school for education. And I went to college, I went to yeshiva, I worked as a rabbi for a couple of years. And then I realized like I needed more education in education. Anyways, I was dating my wife when I was studying for the GREs. And I was like, the morning of the GREs, she somehow knew that I was like going to be like, try to like, what's it called? Kind of chicken out of it. And so she called me to make sure I got out of bed and went. Now, why would I chicken out? I could have just like kept going it, just kept doing my thing. So, mediocre in some level. And I literally tried to chicken out. I really did. I tried to be like, you know what? I don't really need to do it. I shouldn't do it. I don't think it's physical laziness. Like, look, if I take the GREs, then it means I need to apply to graduate school. And if I apply to grad school, then I actually have to go. And I have to like figure out what I do with it. And I just kind of want my comfort zone,
Right.
Anyways, for all these reasons and more that I'm not even thinking about right now, a person hides from this debt. Every person walking around with a certain debt. They have assets, they have talents, and it's a debt that we know, again, not even theologically, just psychologically, existentially, we know that we have to do something with ourselves.
So when you say debt, I'm assuming like theologically, religiously, you would say a debt to God. And if you want to think of it irreligiously, you would just say a debt like to the universe. Is that the way to phrase it?
You could say to the universe, you could say to your community. Imagine you live on an island and the tribe is like 40 or 50 people. It's going to make a difference. Your contribution makes a difference. The problem is we don't live like that. And so it's so easy to kind of like hide in the shadows and be like, find someone else.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're like living in a city with like 2 million people, then like who are you? You're kind of like what you said when Rabbi Shmuel Lin said the Jewish world. You're like who am I? There's some schlubby guy.
Right. It's like, you don't need another rabbi. It's like someone's going to be a rabbi. It's like there's lots of rabbis out there, right? Like how am I going to make a difference on the margin? Someone's going to be a doctor. Try to convince them to be a doctor because there's a lot of sick and injured people. It's like, there's a lot of sick and injured people. There's a lot of doctors. Like what difference am I going to make? But if you're on an island and you're the only one capable intellectually or whatever of getting trained as a doctor, so then, that's going to be staring you in the face. You really can't, it's much harder to hide, but we try to hide anyways, but anyways, it's a debt to yourself because you know that when you live up to what you're capable of doing, you feel actualized, and you feel good about yourself, and spiritually on some level, that that's your destiny. You owe it to your, the island you live on and your tribe. And of course, more broadly, your community, your society, your city, your country, whatever, the world, the universe. And again, theologically, you owe it to God, meaning even though God doesn't, so to speak, need you per se, he chose to put you in the world, and he chose to put you in the world for you to achieve a certain purpose. And when you do, that fulfills God's desire. In the same way as when your parents spend $250,000 to send you to college, they went to college, presumably. So like they don't need, it's not for them. And it's not, let's say it's not a case where your dad's sending you so you can join the family business. They want you to achieve your potential. That's their desire as a dad. So if you sleep through class and you don't try hard, you're failing yourself. You're failing the part of your society that you would have benefited if you got that training. Your dad paid that money for you to make the most of yourself. You're failing his hopes for you. So I think there's all these different ways of looking at it. Which one is going to motivate a person? It depends on the person. I really think that I don't know if there's one formula. It's interesting that for Will, like you mentioned, the thing that got under his skin was this thing that he's failing himself. he wasn't motivated by his buddy Chucky's thing about you're failing me and our community. Like that, apparently that didn't speak to him.
Yeah, no, I think it did. I think he actually cared less about the fact that he's failing himself. It was like, oh, like I owe it to myself. Why do people keep saying that? And then when Chucky said, no, you owe it to me, it kind of like was a slap in the face. That's what motivated him.
You're saying he chose the interpretation of his therapist, right? I owe it to myself because if I owe it to myself, then it's up to me to choose whether I want to do it or not. That's what you're saying?
Right. Yes, I think so.
I understand. Yeah. I think that's very common that people get more motivated when it's some external, when it's another person or people outside of themselves. Just because once you say it's about you actualizing yourself, even though you would think people are more selfish than selfless, I guess you can kind of play tricks with yourself more. It's very hard for a person to think about their deathbed reflections. And when you're young, you're like, I'm sure I'll be happy. If I just kind of like lead a simple life and like hang out with my kids, which is a wonderful thing, right? But we can kind of like sell ourselves short when we're young because it's very hard to think about what you're going to be pondering on your deathbed about. Did you lead a life that was worth living? Did you lead a life that you're proud of? So I think that's why it's probably easier to motivate yourself with the needs of people that are clear and present and are asking you to help.
Could we potentially, is there any way we could do like almost like a 2-minute summary, quoting the Mesilat Yesharim, right? The path of the just?
Yeah.
So I guess just to kind of almost like summarize. So we were asking, does Will have an obligation, seemingly moral obligation, to actualize himself?
It's an obligation to himself, to others, the universe, to God. The question is, how do you motivate a person? My initial answer was whatever works. Right. I think people are motivated by different factors, but as we kind of spoke it out, I kind of think that in general, it's easier for a young person to be motivated, ironically, by a need outside of themselves, a need that they can see by people who are saying, we need you, than from them to think more deeply about, their existential need, the kinds of things that they would think about on their deathbed.
And before we move on to the next question, that actually is really interesting. That affected Will that way. It affected you that way. Any idea like why? Especially because we would naturally think a teenager or someone in their early 20s would not necessarily care about how his actions affect other people. He'd care more about himself. Like that's like almost, it's like such a stereotype to think of kind of the selfish teenager, the selfish college student. Like why is it that they're more affected by how their decisions are impacting anyone else? Like, why would that be? It just seems counterintuitive.
Okay, so person is complex. And the beginning of complexity of a person is that they have a body and a soul, which can also be called in Hebrew Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov. Yetzer Hara is referring to the part of the psyche that is selfish, and Yetzer Hatov is the part of the psyche that is selfless and divine. In Chassidus, in the Tanya, it's called the Nefesh HaBahamas, the animal soul, and the Nefesh HaLokis, the divine soul. It's all talking about the same thing. So you're right. When we're children are, from a psychological point of view, very similar to animals. No offense to children. But they're looking out for themselves. Kids are looking out for themselves and what's good for them. They're avoiding things that are not good for them. Kids are pretty much kind of self-centered creatures. Right? They're looking out for what's good for them because the part of the psyche that's there, that's more developed and robust is the animal soul, the Yetzer Hara, the body is more salient. The part of the soul that's divine, that's selfless, that's called the Yetzer Tov, the divine soul, the Nefesh Elokis, the Neshama, all those words, that part does not really start to shine brightly into the psyche until kids hit puberty, more or less, which is when their sense of responsibility starts to develop. Responsibility, the sense of true selflessness, the sense of doing the right thing because it's the right thing, doing good because it's good, not because it's going to benefit them, and not even because their mommy or daddy is going to congratulate them. So that part gets developed later. Now, why is it that for people the doing good to others is more motivating, because you're not talking to the selfish part. You're trying to speak to the selfless part of the person. And so by definition, the selfless part is more motivated by the good that he or she can do for others. You know, it's actually very interesting. There's one of the great psychologists of the 20th century, Abraham Maslow, Jewish psychologist, go figure. So he actually has his famous Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which, you know, at the bottom, there's like kind of the basic things that a person needs, food and shelter and all these things. And then you can kind of build on that. And at the top of the pyramid, you know, if you have all those things taken care of, then you can work on self-actualization. That was at the top of the pyramid. However, if I'm not mistaken, I think he had a heart attack in his 50s or 60s. I forget exactly when. And kind of his life flashed before his eyes. And he actually realized that his pyramid was incomplete. And so he added something later. You know, if you Google Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'll find kind of the first iteration. But if you Google some more, you'll see the second iteration, which includes above self-actualization, is self-transcendence. The desire of the person to go beyond themselves, not just actually, to go beyond themselves. And this is, I think, what you're speaking to. So I think, you know, if you're able to get through to the person, I think it's going to motivate them more. I think there's a simple reason, which I mentioned before, which is that it's kind of easier to get motivated by your friend or your community saying, we need you, right? It's less abstract. It's more concrete. And truthfully, one more piece over here is that going back to Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in his work, Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just, he says that really, you know, ultimately for a person to motivate themselves by their own connection to God or their own self-actualization is really not the full picture and is incomplete. He says really life is about actualizing yourself, you know, doing the true will of God, you know, fulfilling your mission for why you're here in the world. But a person needs to think beyond that. And he says that if a person is not really thinking about how to make the world better, that how he or she lives his life to its fullest, that it raises up the world around him. And if he or she does not, it lowers the world around him. If you're not thinking about how it affects, how it goes beyond you and your personal relationship to Hashem, it's incomplete and it's something off. There's something off about it. So he actually speaks it out explicitly.
So that insight almost kind of, I think, leads me into my next point, and that is we see like a battle play out between the professor and Robin Williams, like the therapist, between being demanding and being empathetic. And I want to emphasize Chucky because we were talking about how Will is more motivated by, you know, the effect he has on other people. When Chucky kind of gives it to him and says like, hey, don't do it for yourself, you do it for me, right? Because you've got this golden ticket that any of us wished we could have. And the professor is really just trying to kind of expose Will to all these different opportunities. And when Will kind of makes light of the interviews, the professors are saying like, hey, look, I would hire you myself. I'm just trying to expose you to like what's possible and kind of to give your mind free reign. And he very much has in mind that this could be the next Einstein. This could be the next guy who cures polio. And that doesn't really speak to Will. Will isn't as interested in that. However, he does respond to Chucky. Interestingly, even though Chucky, it's almost kind of, it's like less idealistic. It's more practical. It's more about like the socioeconomic conditions that they're in, and that's what motivates him. So how do you explain that?
I think it depends on the person. Again, it's like people are motivated by different things. People have different backgrounds. The point is that we want a person, to first of all, make a general choice that they don't want to hide from their debt, from their obligation, that we want people to choose life. How to motivate them, I think that depends on who they are and where they're at in life and how old they are and all that stuff. And the truth of the matter is that, as they say, it takes a village to raise a person. And so usually it's the combination of these voices that a person hears that speaks to different parts of them and gets us to keep plugging away at life and developing ourselves.
The impression I'm getting is there's no right way and wrong way. It's just, I think the first time I saw the movie, kind of get the impression that the professor is this kind of bad actor. Perhaps the more I matured and, I don't know, maybe got a bit of a different perspective, it is frustrating. I mean, you could just imagine having this professor watching this genius just kind of throw it all away for whatever reason. He's not as interested emotionally in Will. And that's what's kind of funny. I want to focus on that in terms of to what degree, again, do you push a person, regardless of kind of the emotional things they're going through, because Chucky doesn't, I'm sure Chucky cares about his friend, but Chucky doesn't care. He doesn't mention like, Will, you figure out if you're emotionally okay, and then you could decide whether or not to cash your ticket. Chucky doesn't care. Chucky's not like, oh gosh, let's have like a therapy session together. He wants to push him. The professor is also not as interested. Robin Williams is the one who, it's true, well, Robin Williams does kind of question him and push him a bit, but he's much more interested in his psychological needs. So I guess my question, again, is there fundamentally a right or wrong way, or is it kind of the right way is the professor, and we just kind of bring in the therapist to kind of overcome the issues until we could get more towards the focus of actualization?
Okay, so let's get into this dimension. I actually don't think we've actually gotten into this piece a little bit, maybe a little bit with the control and the dichotomy. Okay. The Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, it gives a principle that's very common, very often repeated, which is that a person should always push away with the left and bring close with the right. And it gives examples of people who didn't do that and the results were bad. All this is to say that there's basically these two modalities. There's the critique. There's you got to push yourself. You're not doing good enough. You could do more. That's called the trait of judgment, of judgmentalism, let's say, right? And that's associated with the left hand. And it says you need to, every educator needs to push with the left hand. But you also need to bring close. You need to show love, appreciation, that you're doing great, you're amazing, right? And that's with the right hand. It's interesting. The Talmud says you should always, push the left hand first. The Talmud cautions with pushing with two hands, because then people just run away. So I think this is the tension between the professor, who is like pushing Will with like that harshness. He kind of giving him the proverbial slaps across the face. And then the other therapist, who is much more therapeutic and much more compassionate. But if I'm not mistaken, at some point he kind of like loses cool with him, right? Because he's not getting it. The therapeutic path is too soft. He needs the proverbial slap across the face. That's the tension. They're the two tools. It really doesn't work to only use one. You're not going to get very far. Either you're going to be too harsh and the person's going to run away, or you're going to be too soft and patient and therapeutic and the person's not going to feel that they need to grow.
That actually is a follow-up question I had, because it is interesting. And I did notice that it's true. The therapist does eventually kind of effectively push Will out, because Will refuses to grow, in terms of the therapist is asking, what do you want to do? What do you want to do, Will? What do you want to do? And Will just refuses to answer the question. And it's understood that apparently because Will doesn't know. So the therapist effectively says, like, he opens the door and was like, well, you see, like, are you kicking me out? And the answer is kind of like, yeah, but, and that is true. That is kind of, I guess, more like the left hand. But I did notice that there are different people who play different roles. Like Chucky was not all soft and warm and cuddly. He kind of just gave it to him straight. The professor was obviously like that. I mean, he could be gentle and he was trying to be nice to Will, but at the end of the day, he wanted to kind of push Will. It was the therapist who was the kind, gentle, understanding, empathetic advisor. Is it possible for like one person to do both tasks, or is that like too hard? Like you do really need, it's like a good cop, bad cop kind of act. Is that like a fundamental precept of education?
Listen, you see the model in Jewish wisdom, you see the model all over the place. It's the mother-father model. The father classically is more kind of brass tacks. The father is less around classically at home. And the mother is more kind of there for you, unconditional, you know, yes, sweetheart, of course, you're the best, I love you. You see that model in Moshe and Aaron and Aaron. Moshe, again, is more kind of the father, paternal figure. Aaron is more the unconditional love, less critical. Aaron's the one who kind of went with the golden calf episode. Moshe comes down and breaks the 10 Commandments, shatters the tablets. And that's just the beginning. And Aaron was the one who, in his compassion, in his therapeutic approach, he literally went along with it, right? Trying to stall, but he literally went along with their insanity. But you also see in the Jewish academy, in a yeshiva, you also have a Rosh Yeshiva classically, who's like the Moshe figure, who's more kind of brass tacks and like holding people, at least intellectually, to a standard. And then you have the Mashgiach. The Mashgiach is more of like the
So I suspect people think mashgiach is like a kosher mashgiach. What's mashgiach?
Yeah. A mashgiach, lehashgiach is to oversee. So in a kitchen, a mashgiach is the one who's like overseeing to make sure everything's kosher. That's not what this over here is. A mashgiach in the yeshiva, the role of the mashgiach is to be attentive to the human dimension. So the Rosh Yeshiva's job is to push kids intellectually, to work hard and really hold them to task to make sure that they're learning as they should. But the mashgiach's job is to be kind of the Aaron HaKohen, who's kind of attentive to people and there for them and a listening ear, because you do need these two roles. That said, I think any one of them has to have both aspects. So we all specialize, but every person needs to have both aspects for it to work, right? The Rosh Yeshiva needs to have a human dimension, and the mashgiach can't be a softie and just be, you're the best, whatever. There's no standards for you. That doesn't work. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear.
No, I actually thought the analogy was fantastic. So it really does sound like those are two modalities. And I guess it seems like it's best when it's represented by two different people. And actually, if we can go even deeper here, something I thought was interesting was the fact that even though Chucky was kind of like not empathetic with Will, at least when he was kind of like pushing Will and giving it to Will responded to that. I do, as opposed to the professor, right? Who Will is kind of not particularly interested in what the professor has to say. It seems like. I wonder if that's because of the bond that Will had with Chucky, with his best friend. Like his friend could like rough him up a little bit. It sounds intuitive, but I would imagine that a person who loves you and cares for you, you can hear criticism and a person holding you to task from them more than you could from someone like the professor, who kind of like, yes, the professor definitely helped him, got him out of jail, was helping him clean up his life, but it was easier for Will to hear that from Chucky. It's like, why is it that Chucky and the professor seem to have the same kind of like bottom line approach, and Will's able to hear from Chucky and he's not so much able to hear from the professor?
100%. Yeah. The principle in plain English is you can push someone as much as you support them, which is really kind of another way of saying what the Talmud said, that you could push a person with your left, but you got to make sure that you're bringing them close with your right. Otherwise, it doesn't work. A person needs to feel that you're pushing them to grow. You're not pushing them away. You're pushing them to grow. You're not going anywhere. You're not going to abandon them if they don't get their act together. You're not going to abandon them. You're there no matter what. You're pushing them for their own good. The Talmud says, in one place it says, I forget who says it, but it says, if you see that your student, you've explained a matter to your student a bunch of times in a bunch of different ways and they're still not getting it, it's probably because they think you're frustrated with them. That's actually what the Talmud says. And it says you need to show them more love, which is very interesting. Another piece over here is, which is really important, is there's a mitzvah from the Torah. One of the 613 mitzvot is to give rebuke, to tell a person off. Tell a fellow Jew is doing something wrong, you have to tell them off. Now, what does it mean to tell them off? It's actually, my rabbis heard this from one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that it's the most difficult mitzvah to do, because it's very easy to tell someone off. It's very hard to tell someone off effectively in a way they're going to listen. And why? So the Talmud itself addresses this. The Talmud says that when you tell a person, it's a funny expression, that you have a splinter, you have like a splinter on your forehead or something. I'm messing it up, the translation. And it says, oh yeah, you have a beam between your eyes. So it's like people get defensive because they think you're attacking them. And so their natural thing is, especially because people don't want to change, again, going back to that laziness thing, people don't want to face their obligations. So the response is just to push it off and say, well, you got a bigger issue, right? You have the same issue, but worse. So it's for this reason you need to feel that unconditionality. The person who's considered the greatest at this in the 20th century is someone by the name of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, known as the Alter of Slobodka. I'm kind of very biased. He's really my Rebbe's Rebbe. Like he's my great grand Rebbe. So there's a rabbi named Rav Shlomo Volbe. Rav Shlomo Volbe was a student of a rabbi named Rav Yitzhak Hutner, and Rav Yitzhak Hutner was a student of this rabbi, the Alter of Slobodka, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. After Rav Yitzhak Hutner passed away, Rav Shlomo Volbe was at the Shiva, the house of mourning, and someone said a story about, the greatness of Rav Yitzhak Hutner. The story goes that the altar of Slobodka was very harsh with Rabbi Jack Cohen. Rabbi Jack Cohen was very, very bright, very sharp mind, very sharp sense of humor, very self-confident. And when he came, the other boys in the yeshiva were like very impressed with him. And he also like dressed very well and had a swagger to him. And the altar, who was known for really kind of being very caring and gentle, and his whole education philosophy was much more positive, known as much more positive, generally was very harsh with Rabbi Jack Cohen. And there's a bunch of stories, one is that he called him to the Torah, and he himself, the altar, he read from the Torah, which was not his custom to be the one who reads from the Torah publicly, but he chose to read in the Torah, and he called Rabbi Jack Cohen for an aliyah to the Torah, and apparently the word Rasha, which means wicked, appeared a bunch of times in that particular aliyah, and he kind of paused and looked at him, which is kind of a crazy thing to do. And so this person at the Shiva of Rabbi Jack Cohen is praising Rabbi Jack Cohen for being able to kind of hear those words of rebuke and really take them to heart and not get defensive. And the story goes that Rav Shlomo Volbe corrected him and said, no, that's not a praise of Rabbi Jack Cohen. It's a praise of the altar of Slobodka. Because the altar of Slobodka loved his students so much and was able to convey to them that love, that unconditional love. That's why they were able to receive rebuke from him. So to this point, that really a mentor needs to really legitimately, sincerely care about his students. And only if your student knows that you're not going anywhere, you're not threatening to abandon them if they don't live up to your standards or even their own potential, that you're there for them no matter what, but that you're holding them to a standard because it's for their good. And that you know that they will thank you for it. If they know that, then you can push them. If not, you're going to push them away, not push them to grow.
That is actually really interesting, because now that I'm thinking about the interactions, you see that Chucky clearly cares about Will. Will knows this. Will himself effectively says it. But then even when the therapist kind of kicks Will out, Will is really surprised by it because he wasn't expecting that. And I think they've built enough rapport that Will kind of understands what the therapist is doing, and Will comes back. But when Will burns the proof that he gave the professor, and the professor is kind of like freaking out about it. And you can, again, like, this isn't to be overly harsh with the professor. You can almost understand, like, the professor really was trying to help Will, but the professor's response was, most days I wish I never met you, because then I could sleep at night. I don't have to walk around with the knowledge that there was someone like you out there. And then Will leaves. And then the professor says, and I didn't have to watch you throw it all away. And there are a few things we could say about this, but I think perhaps the impression Will was getting was like, wait, you're so happy, you wish you'd never met me? What kind of thing is that to say? Now, perhaps you could say that, but maybe only if you're someone like, again, like Lahavdil, right? Obviously making the separation between this fictional character and the altar of Slobodka. But maybe if you're like the altar, you could say something like that. But when Will heard it from the professor, he's like, this guy doesn't, like, am I just like a math mind, or am I a human being? I wonder if that's almost why Will was so resistant to anything the professor had to say.
It's a beautiful thing, because I think there's such a deep personalization of these gifts. We kind of like, we see someone who's brilliant, a genius, they're like a walking brain, and like, oh, like, you could do so much with that brain. If only I can get you to use your mind for good, you'd be able to get so much good done. And that's a kind of depersonalization. I want to use your gifts, as opposed to, you are a special person. I want this for you. I want you to lead a life that you're proud of. There's that kind of sacredness of the human being, which is lost when we are seduced by the gifts themselves, when we depersonalize the gifts, which I think is the theme that you're picking up on. And I think the thing that kind of made Will recoil, it's like, oh, you like my intelligence, you don't like me. A person can help another person because they have something to gain from it. A person can help another person because they want to pat themselves on the back and feel proud about themselves. And a person can help another person in kind of like abstraction, like for the good of the world. You can have an Olympic coach who takes on an athlete because they want to get the gold medal. You can have a rabbi, educate a brilliant Talmudic mind because they want the mitzvah, they want the zchut, the merit, they want the reward in heaven, But all of those things are depersonalizations. That's not, Judaism really opens up with the individual and the sacredness of the individual. Every individual is made in the image of God. And when we lose sight of that, people can tell. People can feel it. They can feel that when you're helping them for their own good, you care about them, that you relate to them with a sacredness, and they can tell when you're using them. They can tell when you're depersonalizing them, that you're doing it for some kind of mystical religious obligation, but you don't care about them. People can smell that, and it hurts. It hurts a lot. And they move away. I think people move away. People are desperately looking for mentors who care about them, for people in their lives who can push them even. Really, I think we're all looking for someone who can push us to grow, but we want that person who pushes us to grow to have our best interest at heart, to really care about us.
Wow. And you know what? This is actually this is a perfect lead-in. It's almost like you're setting me up. So thank you. Was the conversation between the professor and Robin Williams in the bar, where, if I just read it out to you, because it's just so powerful.
Go for it.
The professor says, "So this isn't about me, Sean." Sean is Robin Williams. "I'm nothing compared to this young man. In 1905, there were hundreds of professors renowned for their study of the universe, but it was a 26-year-old Swiss patent clerk doing physics in his spare time who changed the world. Can you imagine if Einstein would have given that up just to get drunk with his buddies in Vienna every night? We all would have lost something." And then Robin Williams says, pretty dramatic, Jerry, "Professor, no, it isn't, Sean. This boy has that gift. He just hasn't got the direction, but we can give that to him." And then later on, the professor again says, "That's exactly what I'm talking about. We got to give this kid direction. He can contribute to the world, and we can help him do that." Then Robin Williams says, "Direction's one thing, manipulation's another." And then the professor gets really upset and says, "Sean, I'm not sitting at home every night twisting my mustache and hatching a plan to ruin this boy's life. I was doing advanced mathematics when I was 18, and it still took me 20 years to do something worthy of a Fields Medal." So you don't feel pierced through that? What? So we're talking about pushing someone. People want to be pushed. And the professor's like, "Look, I'm not trying to manipulate him." So, but then again, the professor almost brings back the Fields Medal. Kind of like we said, the guy's like a walking brain. There's almost like a depersonalization to Will. Can we just go through that? What is the difference between, if you were to ask the professor, he would say, "I'm just trying to guide him. I'm trying to push him. I'm trying to help him." And the professor probably genuinely felt that. From the therapist's perspective, it was manipulation. Is that just kind of look, that's a legitimate side and that's a legitimate side? Or when do you kind of move over from pushing into manipulation? Does that question make sense?
I hear. Listen, there's two pieces here. Piece number one is sincerity. You either sincerely care about a person or you don't. It's one or the other, right? You either care about the person or you care about something else. So I can't tell you my assessment of that professor, but it sounds like that professor himself has some sort of complex being gifted. He was gifted and he worked on his gifts, and this kid kind of haunts him because he kind of speaks to this kind of issue he has himself with his own gifts and his own success and the meaning of his life and whatnot. So as he's working on Will, he's actually working on himself. Let's just say.
Interesting.
And for Robin Williams, he also haunts him in a different way. He also speaks to his own gifts and what he made of his own gifts, and did he really do everything he could with his own gifts? But he cares about him, and he also cares about himself, and that's probably why he also didn't push himself in the way that Professor did, because he has compassion for himself. He's a more compassionate person. So there was that thing, do you care about the other person or not? Then let's say you do care about a person. So then to what degree do you manipulate them for their own good? Manipulate means, do you use carrots and sticks, incentives and threats to get them to where they need to get to? That's another question, right? And that kind of manipulation is not bad. That kind of manipulation is good. We use incentives all the time. Incentives are brilliant and they're critical. But at the end of the day, nothing is a replacement for the individual making choices themselves. And that's all the manipulation we're doing, is to get the person to a place where they can see truth and they can choose truth. They can see goodness and they choose goodness intrinsically. When that happens and the person gets intrinsic enjoyment of doing the right thing because it's the right thing, that's when the person has now changed. And that change is irreversible. Once the person actually, it clicks, the soul is transformed. That's what we're going for. That's the goal over here. I think we got to a really good place, and I appreciate it because it really helped me. I watched this movie when I was so young. And so now that we're talking about it, why did I intuitively understand this movie to be such a good movie when I was so young? I think it does such a good job of speaking to these profound struggles and insights and dilemmas of being human, of growing up, of education, of our gifts, of self-esteem, of what's expected from us. It's really quite amazing. I'm very grateful for this conversation. Okay. Thank you so much, Ophir, for this conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.